Grade school! What's going on, everybody? Oh my goodness, I missed you guys. It was like almost physically painful to be apart from you all last week. I was so excited about our conversation, and I got derailed by some personal matters right before showtime last week. So apologies to those of you who were already in the room and already fired up to chat about last week's subject. I was too, so much so that I didn't want to miss out on those subjects this week. So today we're doing a very special episode of Grade School. We're doing a double header, a double feature. We're going to go for 90 minutes today, and we're going to talk about lots of stuff. We're going to talk about the subjects that we covered here on the channel last week, which include working with middle gray and how we can utilize that in our color grades, macro level looks, and then this week we talked about how we can make better use of color charts, as well as really getting a clearer understanding of how LUTs work. So all that stuff is fair play as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to start today by answering a couple of questions that came in about mid-gray that I thought were really good, really insightful, the kind of questions that lead to greater insight, greater understanding of the subject. And this is a format that I'm going to be trying out today that I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. I'm kind of thinking about going through comments throughout the week for a given video and just seeing if any comments really stand out as exceptional, and starting off the show with a question of the week, as it were. So we're going to try that out today, see how it feels. You guys can let me know how it feels. Let me know if I picked some good questions, if you're like, geez, this guy picked a stinker. Anyway, in case you can't tell, I'm super excited to be here. It's going to be an awesome doubleheader session, and we got 90 minutes, but we also got a lot to cover. So I'm going to dive right in. My buddy Rafa's here with me. What's going on, Rafa?
Hello, everyone. I'm now suffering these hot summers of Spain, but they're really nice. I love the beach, so that's a no problem for me.
Yeah, bro. I don't think you're going to get any sympathy from most of us. The image of you like chilling on the beach with like a beverage of choice doesn't sound too bad to me.
Yeah, yeah, quite the opposite, right?
Yeah. All right, guys, let's dive in. So I'm going to read off a couple of those questions that I mentioned earlier that I thought were really, really good. And we're going to start with these. These were both pertaining to mid-gray. And here's the first one. This came from Renee. Renee says, I still don't get why it is important to preserve middle gray. My impression is that this presupposes a correctly exposed clip and, more fundamentally, a correctly exposed skin of talent. But what if the shot is not correctly exposed? What if the skin is underexposed or over, with a pronounced contrast ratio on the shadow side of the face? What relevance does middle gray have in this instance? And this question actually sparked off a really good discussion there in the comment thread for that video, but I wanted to just weigh in with my thoughts on this because I thought it was a really good question, and it's something that I've thought about a lot. And by the way, as many of you guys already know, one of my favorite subjects in the entire realm of color science and motion imaging is middle gray. I think it's so simple and so fascinating and has such a pivotal role to play in the way that we master compelling motion images. I love thinking about it. I love talking about it. And the more I explore it, the more I realize there's more to learn about it. So really excited to talk about it today. By the way, I hope you guys aren't hearing too much of the insane construction noise going on outside of my house. They're working on something out there. They're working really, really hard. I don't know what they're working on, but I can hear it from here. So I hope you guys can't, at least not as loudly as I can. Hope this microphone is doing its job. Anyway.
Well, it seems like the frames in the streaming are like lagging a lot for some reason.
Oh, okay.
The audio is nice, but the frame rate is quite weird because it stops like every second.
Man, I just can't win. I can't win. Yeah. Okay, I've got an idea for this one actually, guys. Hang on one second. Sometimes this camera just likes to get a little refresh. You guys can let me know if that fixed it. I'll dive into answering this first question, and if it didn't fix it, then we'll have another crack at it. Okay, so Renee's question about why exactly is it important to preserve middle gray? Well, if I was really in a hurry and I really didn't care about nuance, my simple answer to the question, why is it important to preserve middle gray? It's not. When we're color grading, it's actually not important to preserve middle gray at all. That's the biggest sort of dichotomy that we have to think about when we're talking about color grading and image mastering and middle gray is critically important, but the one place where it isn't critically important is in color grading. Really, when I emphasize middle gray, I'm talking more about the macro level of things. That's the number one place we want to preserve middle gray explicitly. Now, here's the other thing that I will tell you. When you are working on individual shots and grading individual shots, if you have your pivot point set to the middle gray of your working space, as I talked about in last week's video on middle gray, in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, which is what we normally work in here on this channel, that middle gray pivot point here in Resolve would be, let me just flip over to that real quick. That middle gray pivot point, like with your contrast pivot, would be at 0.336, okay? And let me just flip back we were kind of playing jazz in our last grade school, and I was doing some manual color management in nodes. We're just going to go back to our normal state of affairs here in grade school and elsewhere on the channel, where we just manage things in our normal fashion, like so. And I'm going to turn this back on, hit save. Now, what I wanted to point out is with contrast pivot here, if I set my pivot to 0.336, by the way, it's already at an arbitrary value when I start grading, isn't it? 0.435 has no relationship. That's not a meaningful number. That's just a random number that we use, right? If we change that arbitrary value to 0.336, what this means is that on average, if you are adjusting contrast downstream of exposure, which is what we normally do if you take my prescription, my template node tree that I always recommend here on the channel, if we have an image that we have that has either come in properly exposed or that we are making properly exposed here in our exposure node, that means here in the ratio node with a pivot set to 0.336, on average, we will need to move our pivot less because it's already anchored at the middle gray of the system. Now, does this mean we should not or cannot ever move this pivot? Absolutely not. When we're color grading, you need to feel free to just move the knobs intuitively and to work intuitively. And that's really, you could look at everything else that I talk about here on the channel, all of the systematic stuff that I talk about, all of the rules, all of the concepts when it comes to look design and pipeline and all that stuff. Really, all of those concepts are in place so that you can feel free to just work with the tools that you use when you're color grading and not feel like, oh, I can't go too far that way, or I can't do this with that, or I can't do that with this, to simply feel free. To feel free and to know that you are not taking unnecessary detours or making compensations for stuff that you've already done elsewhere that you didn't realize. That's what the purpose of systems is. Once you are actually color grading, you want to feel free to play and you want to feel confident that you're not compensating for errors and unnecessary mistakes that you made elsewhere. Okay, so that would be the one thing I would say about using pivot in your shot level grading, which we talked about in our mid-grade video. When you set this value to 0.336, this is the value that will cause you to have to move your pivot on average the least across the entirety of your shots because it represents 18% middle gray in the system that you are grading in. And I hope that also kind of touches on the second part of Renee's really good question of like, well, what about if the shot's overexposed? What about if the shot is underexposed? Well, if the shot is over or underexposed, I will deal with that here so that by the time I'm flowing into my ratio node, I should have a middle gray that is on average close to 18% gray in my working space. Same idea with my macro level look. Why do we bother to preserve middle gray in a macro level look when we are going to get all kinds of over and underexposed shots flowing through that look? Well, it's because by the time any shot hits our macro level look, it will already have had its exposure adjusted. So on average, the place where I will have to move off of the least is going to be the middle gray of the system. Okay, so hope that kind of fleshes out and gives some dimension to a discussion that I think was already going really well in the comment thread, but I did just want to weigh in with a couple of ideas there. Okay, and one more that I wanted to cover before we jump into everyone else's questions.
Maybe we could take a second because it seems like the frames are still dropping even in Resolve. So it seems like it's not a camera problem or like an OBS problem.
Okay. Let's see. I actually don't know exactly. Oh yeah, let's see. Drop.
Maybe try to change the bitrate as a first line of defense.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't know how to do that. Let's see here.
It's options in the output menu in the options.
In OBS?
Yeah, it's settings and then output.
Let's see. Huh. Okay. I mean, it's at an arbitrary value right now. I wouldn't really know where to move it to. Okay. It almost feels like I don't want to stop the stream because I feel like that's going to nuke the whole thing, but it almost feels like just to stop and start would do the trick.
Yeah, it seems like it seems like we're gonna have to do that.
Huh. Okay. Let's see here. Let's see if we can't figure this out for you guys. Let's see here. Yeah, YouTube thinks the connection is excellent.
Yeah, Camera Trim is saying in the chat that make sure that the bitrate is set to CBR.
I love how many experts we have on this stuff. I love being friends with geeks. You guys are cool. I don't even have an option for CBR versus something else.
It should be in the rate control menu, in settings output, and then rate control.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a rate control. I'm in settings output, but no rate control. Oh, maybe I have to enable custom? No. Okay. Well, let's just try changing this video bitrate to something. And maybe that'll like wake up the stream. Because it does look like it's like, yeah, I'm showing like tons and tons of dropped frames in here. That's so annoying. I just want to party with you guys. And I feel like, I actually don't know this either, but I feel like if I hit stop, it's going to nuke everything.
Yeah. Yeah, people are saying in the chat that one day their eyes sound good, one day that the problem comes in.
I feel like it's like my golf game. I'm like, when the putter's on, I can't hit it for anything off of the tee box and vice versa. There's always at least one thing wrong with the putting, chipping, and driving. Okay.
Camera Trim is saying in the chat that it's asking if you are on the simple or the advanced tab in encoding settings.
I'm in simple, and I can't change that probably because it's streaming.
Makes sense.
Right, I would assume that's why I can't change it. Well, I really don't want to stop this stream because I feel like it's just going to nuke the whole live. Darn. Gosh, I don't know, guys. I mean, I think this is frustrating. All right, I'll tell you what. I'm going to try stopping this stream, and if it all goes down, then we'll have to build a new one, and I hope you guys will.
Let me know if we're going to use a different link, because people are asking for that in the chat.
It looks like it might be working.
The same. Yeah, I think it's the same stream as well.
Yeah, so it looks like I was able to resume the stream, and things look green and happy in my OBS.
Yeah, people are saying in the chat that everything is cool.
Victory! Okay, that was... Yeah. Okay, I'm going to take back all of my grouchiness about this. That was worth it just for the little endorphin hit that I got just now. Okay, let's get back to business. You guys are awesome. Thanks for bearing with us. Okay, so we've covered one of my 2 questions of the week. And the second one that I want to talk about comes from I Go by Zach. Great tips as always. Thanks, Colin. I'm wondering, though, why is the spike in the histogram after looking at DaVinci Wide Gamut Middle Gray not sitting at 33.6 and instead at what looks like 38.4 on the 0 to 100 scale? I'll put this one to you guys to think about for just a minute. I thought it was a great question. Anyone have any ideas on that? While you ponder that, I'm going to reset my UI layout and fix yet another technological snafu here, because my scopes weren't working. So let's do this and that and this. When you're the parent of a 1-year-old, you get into the maybe annoying habit of over narrating like every single thing that you do. It's a real thing, guys. They call it sportscasting in child development. It's supposed to be very helpful, but it's a habit I'm having difficulty breaking myself of. Especially because I wasn't exactly, I was doing that a little bit even before my daughter was born, because colorists tend to narrate themselves. Anyway, so the question was, why does my mid-gray not rest at 33.6? Well, let's just take a look at that and see what we can see here. So it looks like Zach is right, isn't he? Look, we're sitting at just below 40 when I look at this, but I just got done telling you guys mid-gray in DaVinci Intermediate is at 33.6 or at 0.336. Well, what gives? What's the deal? Well, here's the deal. This has to do with the way that we are outputting, because remember, this is not mid-gray in DaVinci Intermediate that we're looking at on the scopes or visually here. We are working with mid-gray in DaVinci Intermediate if I mess with stuff here, for example. But what I'm seeing here and what I'm seeing in my scopes is DaVinci wide gamut gray after being mapped out to display. So if I go to my project settings and I were to temporarily turn my, actually even easier if I just bypass all of my color management. Now we can see that little bar moved and we're now resting at a 33.6%. If I put in a reference level here, we can actually see, let me put that like this, 33.6. When I turn this off and on in my reference level, there's no change whatsoever because I'm dead on to it. So another good question, really common one that comes up a lot, mid-gray of our working space and mid-gray of our display space are actually not the same thing. And to make it even more confusing, mid-gray in our display space is actually not one explicit correct or incorrect value. It depends on creative intent. It depends on a number of different factors, but there's no single, like I can't tell you, hey, what's the correct mid-gray for Rec 7 or 9? There is none. I can tell you that traditionally, historically, we tend to place mid-gray at about 10% of the linear peak of the output of that display. So at 100 nits in Rec 7 or 9, that would be around 10 nits, which does indeed net out to around a 0.4 when you apply a gamma function to it. But there's no single explicit correct answer to the question of what is the mid-gray of a display color space. Anyway, another fun question, fun thing to talk about when it comes to mid-gray. All right, that's my questions of the week. Let's take everyone else's questions of the week. Let's hear from you guys. What do you want to know? What do you want to talk about?
We have a question from Richard, and he's asking about camera LUTs, but not the classical camera LUTs, but the camera LUTs that you can find in the RAW tab. What is your opinion about camera LUTs that you can find in the RAW tab, basically?
Camera LUTs in the RAW tab? Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah.
I am not familiar with such a thing.
I think, for example, Blackmagic offers like a Rec 709 lookup table that you can enable or disable. And I don't think there's like a creative lookup table there. I might be wrong, though.
Help me find that. Where would that be if I'm like here in Resolve right now?
I don't think you can find it in RE clips, but if you have like a Blackmagic clip, Blackmagic RAW, I think you can enable the lookup table if you used that lookup table while shooting.
Oh, okay. So I would assume that is this, apply LUT. I'm looking at my Blackmagic RAW right here. That simply means apply whatever LUT you were monitoring with in camera. So it's not a creative LUT or a look LUT. It's simply like, hey, whatever LUT was being used in camera, just apply that and use that as the starting point. So that's generally something we would want to avoid, even if you want to use the exact same LUT for whatever reason. Like let's say you shot in Blackmagic Film Gen 5, like whatever your settings were, and you want to actually grade under the same LUT that you shot under, you would still want to have access to that LUT and place it somewhere in your node tree so that you can grade underneath it as opposed to applying it right at the decode stage and then doing all of your grading downstream or after that LUT, if that makes sense. But that's really just asking if you want to apply right at the head of the image chain the same LUT that was used to monitor the image on set, which is typically going to be a camera space to display space type of LUT.
Let's go to your 2383 lookup table for DaVinci Wide Gamut, and a couple of questions here. How does the highlight roll-off or the soft ceiling in your 2383 interact with a high need HDR deliverable? And yeah, that's basically the question.
Cool. Yeah, great question. So here's the fun thing about HDR. To answer that question, we have to get a bit of a context for what HDR means. Does HDR mean a brighter image? Does HDR mean brighter peak luminance of our image? Does HDR mean a wider color gamut? Confusingly, the answer to all those questions is maybe. It might mean those things. That's sort of like, we're going to come back to my two favorite categories of analogy, food and vehicles. I can't think of any food right now. Maybe it's because it's early in the session and breakfast wasn't that long ago. But if we think about cars for a second, let's think about the bed of a heavy-duty pickup truck versus the trunk of a Honda Civic. Okay? Does the bed of a heavy pickup truck have more cargo in it than the trunk of a Honda Civic? Well, maybe. It depends on the cargo that you put into each, right? But not necessarily. There's nothing inherently the bed of a heavy-duty pickup truck cannot tell you about the content that might go in there one day. So the reason I make that analogy is when we think about HDR, HDR gives us the potential for a greater peak luminance. It gives us the potential for redder reds, greener greens, bluer blues, more color gamut effectively. But that does not mean we have to avail ourselves of that potential. In the same way that if I'm tired of moving apartments and it taking 20 trips in my Civic and I say, I'm going to go buy a heavy-duty pickup truck and now I can make that move in just 2 trips or in 1 trip or whatever, that doesn't necessarily, like, just because I buy that pickup truck, that doesn't dictate what I'm going to put in it. So with HDR, if you're talking about, to go back to the question, how will my Kodak 2383 LUT interact with an HDR image? Well, it depends on the HDR image that you're trying to master. For example, if I'm setting my peak luminance in HDR, if I'm saying, like, I'll give you guys this example as just an exaggerated one. I know cinematographers and filmmakers who their creative intent for HDR, if I tell them, okay, we've done the SDR pass of your film. Now it's time to do the HDR pass. And by the way, you could do those in either way. Neither is right or wrong. But let's say we did the SDR first, and now they want to do the HDR. And the first thing I'm going to ask them is like, okay, you've now got a bigger space to store your image, right? You've got like a larger vehicle. You've got a pickup truck where you used to have the trunk of a Honda Civic. Do you want to put more stuff in there? Do you have more stuff you want to throw in there? How different or how similar do you want your HDR image to look to your SDR image? There are filmmakers who I work with whose answer is identical. I want the HDR to be identical to the SDR. I want it to have the same dynamic range. I want it to have the same color gamut. I want nothing whatsoever to change. All I want to change is the deliverable itself because that's being required of me by the studio or whomever I'm working with. Okay. So in that case, how will the Kodak 2383 LUT affect that final output? None. Not at all. Right? That's one extreme. Let's look at the other extreme. Let's say I ask a different filmmaker that same question. How similar versus how different do you want your HDR deliverable to look to your SDR deliverable? And they say, as different as possible. I want to use every square inch of the additional dynamic range and the additional color volume available to me in the HDR spec that we are now creating our trim pass for, okay? Which is, of course, a perfectly valid answer as well. So in that case, if you were to throw my Kodak 2383 LUT in line, what you would find is that it is not going to permit highlights brighter than around 500 to 600 nits to pass through. It's going to roll them off completely. So if your intent is to do a 1000 nit master, and I don't mean a 1000 nit master in terms of the spec, I do 1000 nit masters all the time where the peaks never reach higher than 250, for example. But if you are trying to do a 1000 nit master with speculars that actually hit 1000 nits, you shouldn't use the Kodak 2383 LUT. You shouldn't use my LUT for that because it's going to roll over your highlights before they ever get there. And less cut and dry in terms of color gamut, but a similar conversation. You are not going to get the reddest, brightest, most colorful red that you can get out of a 1000 nit P3 HDR deliverable if you apply my Kodak 2383 because it's going to clamp you or confine you or compress you into a smaller subgamut of the larger delivery space. So that's a characteristic that you will often see with like legacy film LUTs, even if they are like or really any film LUT, is that you're going to have some rollover there, which by the way is natural. Like that's a thing that I want to see if I can find a link to this. Maybe Rafa can track it down. There were some really good remarks that were quoted from David Fincher that he was making during a conversation, I believe, with Steven Soderbergh at a recent film festival, where Fincher was talking about remastering 7 for HDR and having to change things around slightly and actually do some composites like in windows and things like that. Because he was observing like, hey, like in these windows, in the original film print, that was in the shoulder. That was just rolled off white. But when you're doing a 500 nit or whatever master, you can actually see that there was just white cardboard on the other side of that window because it's a different rendering intent. So in that case, they had to actually go back and like sketch in a little bit of detail into that window to make it feel like a real world. So it's a big area, but like that to me is a really good example of like, well, in a film system, you're going to have that shoulder, you're going to have that rollover. And in my opinion, aesthetically, that's actually a key part of what makes something kind of filmic, is that you've got a big shoulder that flattens out at a certain point, and you're not getting like at 1,000 nits, you're getting what I would call very pingy, very crispy, very linear highlights that are more true to what you would see out in the real world. The question is, do you want that, or do you want more of the like traditional filmic, like rolling shoulder where things get a little bit more creamy instead of pingy? So I feel like I went down a bit of a rabbit hole there talking about HDR versus SDR and the aesthetics of each and the potential aesthetics of each. But short answer, what's going to happen with the Kodak 2383 when you're doing it in an HDR grade and assume you want to use the full latitude of the HDR space? You are going to be constricted by that Kodak 2383 in a manner consistent with a film print, but in a manner that you may not want if you're looking to get the most screaming 1,000 nit highlights and the reddest, brightest possible reds that you can get, for example.
Oh, I was muted. Another question about your 2383. When you are delivering for SDR instead of HDR, it seems like the white point is a little bit lower as well. So is there a fix for that in SDR?
Yeah, I mean, let's play around with that for a second. Let's see if we can kind of like cook up a circumstance where we might want to produce such a fix. So I'm back to my good old-fashioned color management. I'm going to go over here into my LUTs now. Let's turn this live preview thing off because I can't stand it. You guys might notice a forthcoming goodie lurking in here. Don't worry, I'm gonna hook y'all up very soon. So yeah, if we look at this image, like, it kind of depends on the image, I guess. Like maybe in something like this, yeah, you could see like there's stuff that's really right near the top of the container that's being tamed in a little bit. I mean, to be honest with you, it's a little tough for me to like conceive of a practical context where I would be like, oh no, I really don't want that drop in peak luminance that I'm seeing. Like this image might be the closest that we can get, where there's just this little trace here is dropping down a hair. So the question of like, well, what if I wanted to get those highlights back brighter? I mean, you can still fight underneath the LUT to do that, and just go in and try to crank those up. You know, whether you're doing your highlights or if you do like a little qualifier maybe. You know, I would say I don't think there's probably in most cases anything that is straight up I'm just doing a luminance qualifier here, by the way, and then I'm going to gain this up. You know, like you're getting that increase. I think in most cases there's not going to be any hard like limits inside of the LUT that really will prevent you from being able to get where you want your peak highlights to live. If that were the case, you could look at doing a downstream trim if you wanted to. What I would probably look at sooner than that would be using some of the techniques that I talked about in multiple videos in this channel, but there's one in particular where we talked about customizing LUTs. If we can track down a link to that, it might be good to leave in the chat. But we talked about customizing LUTs and the different things that you can do, including things like using a layer mixer and saying like, oh, I'm going to use my composite mode here, and I'm just going to borrow the color component here. So that would look something like this. I'm going to turn this LUT off. So now I'm just getting the color from that 2383. And now up top here, I could do my own contrast. If I still like the general kind of heavier contrast, but I want to let the highlights really fly. Like now I'm getting film print level of contrast, film print style color remapping down here, but I'm not getting, there's not going to be any kind of shoulder to this because I am creating kind of a custom tailored version of the LUT. So you could look at something like that as well if you really want to completely get out from underneath the shoulder of the 2383.
Actually, there's like a super simple solution to that if you are doing color management in nodes, and it's simply to go to your final color space transform. And since the LUT is not hitting 100 nits, you can basically go a little beyond 100 nits because you have like a very tight margin at the top, right?
That's a great idea. So to do that, you would need to be color managing in nodes as opposed to here in your project settings. You might even be able to do it by setting your working luminance a little bit lower via the same kind of logic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Let's see if that works. So let's just say, and by the way, this stuff doesn't scale linearly at all. Let's just say that I pegged that about right, and I said that the peak of the system that the LUT allows, or the peak luminance that the LUT is going to allow through is around 700 nits. So I don't see a...
I think it should be changed. We should change the output luminance instead of the working luminance, right?
Well, we could do that. The only reason I'm contemplating this first is because to change the output luminance, we would actually have to switch over to a node-based system.
Yeah.
So I'm just looking at, if I set this, yeah, you can see I got a little bump there when I dropped that to now like 300. Like check out my highlights here. Those are, we're really reaching the top of the container now. So that's something else that you could play around with. Or as Rafa suggests, equally valid, probably even a better place to start of changing your output luminance. But to do that, you would need to be color managing in nodes. If you're color managing in your project settings, you could do things like this. And obviously just be aware that when you do this, your working luminance for your grade is now more closely mirroring the ultimate limit that it's going to be hit with when it runs through the LUT. So just something to be aware of. You no longer have all the dynamic range to play with prior to the LUT, but that may be perfectly okay if you're going to be rolling things anyway. What I might do in this case is accompany this with some luminance mapping so that whatever your input dynamic range is, say it's actually 0 to 10,000 nits, you are kind of compressing things into that dynamic range on the way into the working space, and that way you haven't clipped anything out before you even had the chance to grade it or shape it. So hope that's helpful. Mm-hmm. For now, I'm going to go back top floor.
Let's go to color management. And basically now that we're touching on color management in nodes, if you are doing color management in nodes on the color page, what should your color management be under the project settings?
Oh, I love this question. So let's talk about color managing in nodes. I feel like I've said before, I feel like we've got like our regular community who really consistently show up for grade school. And so you guys are awesome, by the way. And I see y'all, and I'm really, really proud of y'all for showing up and making time every Friday to be here. That's super cool. And I feel like one of the fun things about having a community that isn't like constantly revolving. I know we've got some newcomers, usually at least a few every week. If you are new to grade school, by the way, a big welcome. I don't mean to exclude you guys at all. We're glad you're here. We need some fresh air in the room, so we're glad that you're here. Hope you brought donuts, other bad jokes. But for those of you who are here every single week, I feel like there's a growing appetite for talking about node-based color management, which is exciting because like I've shared with you guys before, I color manage in nodes, but node-based color management really requires a more lucid understanding of color management than we need if we're just going to flip a couple settings in our project settings. So that's cool. That means you're graduating. That means you're leveling up. That means you're growing. That means things are clicking. That's awesome. So let's talk about color managing in nodes. I'm going to go into, let's actually do this. I'm just going to bypass color management everywhere so I can turn it back on. And if we're looking at color managing in nodes, here is how I would go about that. And then we can talk about where we would set our project settings here in just a moment. So you guys can see I've got some power grades saved for this. I'll often use groups to do what I'm about to do, but in this case, I'm just going to kind of string it all together here. So we're going to go log C3 to DaVinci wide gamut because that's what this image is. And then I've got an outs power grade folder, and we're going to go DaVinci wide gamut to Rec 709 via resolve color management. So here's how I would set that up, and then I would just do all my grading in between. Maybe this node or that node would go into a group preclip or the timeline level of the node graph, respectively. But regardless, all the grading is going to happen here in the middle. Okay. So what should our settings be here if we're doing this in nodes? Here's what we want to do. Timeline color space. Basically, we want to be in DaVinci Wire GB here because DaVinci Wire GB is the only way to tell Resolve, hey, Resolve, don't do anything that I don't tell you to do. And that's really what we're saying when we color manage in nodes. We're saying, Resolve, I'll take care of it. Don't do anything. Don't help me, you know? So we want to tell Resolve DaVinci Wire GB. However, we still want to set these things up properly for a couple reasons. Timeline color space, we want to set to DaVinci Wide Gamma Intermediate. Output color space, Rec 709 Gamma 24. Why does this matter? Because, by the way, if I change this and hit save, nothing's actually going to change. Even if I've had my color management bypassed, but like here, if I were to change my output color space to something wildly different, aces, watch what happens when I hit save. Nothing. So what the heck does this matter? Here's why these two things matter. Timeline color space matters for any of your color space aware operations when you're grading. So when this is correct, that means everything inside of your HDR zones is correct. That means that when you right click and you do your color space or gamma tags here, that you're going to get the proper results out of those steps. And as you guys know, I love using those things, so it's important to me to have that set up. Those are the two main areas where you're going to see an effect on your grade in terms of the timeline color space. Output color space, the big effect you're going to see there, this is going to affect the metadata tagging in your outputs. So you actually want to Resolve to know, even though I'm telling you don't color manage, and even though I'm working in DaVinci Wide Gamma Intermediate, I'm not outputting in DaVinci Wide Gamma Intermediate. Don't try to tag the file as some sort of big, massive scene space HDR type of deal. Tell the file, pack into the metadata for a file that I deliver on the deliver page, metadata that says, hey, I'm some kind of Rec 709. So that's why, even though it seems these things don't have any immediate effect, it is helpful to set them up properly. And this is definitely part of my sort of like template project, which does involve node-based color management, like I say, and then setting these things accordingly so that I get the proper results in the areas that I just described.
Question about the timeline luminance that we talked about before. Can you explain why would we need that option in the first place? Doesn't that break a scene referred workflow to limit the luminance on the input?
Yes, it does. I couldn't have said it better myself. Why would we need that? Here, I'll tell you my best guess as to the answer to that question. Why we would need that is if we are a colorist who is used to working in a display-referred limited dynamic range context, and we are putting our toe into the water of color management, either because we have to, because we're doing a Dolby Vision Master, or because someone said we really ought to try it, but we're really not comfortable working in that fashion, that's when we would want to have a working luminance that pre-compresses or pre-maps us into a domain or into a kind of like size of sandbox that we're comfortable working in. I can't prove to you that that's the reason, but I would give you that as my strong hypothesis as to why that feature exists at all. It exists because Resolve goes back to, like the hardware-based DaVinci where everybody was grading display referred. And there are tons of colorists working today who either were working on those systems or learned by working or learned from people who taught them based on having worked on those systems. So that legacy is still with us. And there are tons of colorists who haven't yet been equipped with the knowledge and the confidence to work in a dynamic range this freaking big. And they haven't been equipped with, frankly, the tools to know, like, well, what's going to work in that space and what isn't. You guys know, at least many of y'all who've been here with me on the channel for a bit, that like the same good old knobs that you use in a display referred setting, they're not going to work in like a scene space, especially with an unbounded full dynamic range of source. You have to change your thinking. You have to change your tool set. If you haven't done so, you might indeed want to have a timeline working luminance that is more sort of constrained to a legacy position like 200 or 500 or 1,000, like whatever the minimum that you need for the deliverable that you're doing. So that's my best guess.
A question here about our management as well. In a sense, when do you find it is useful to change manually denote gamma to linear?
Lots of instances where that comes in handy, but a couple that we've talked about here on the channel quite a bit are, like, the first one that comes to mind is exposure, for sure. Because remember, if I change my gamma to exposure here in what is going to become, or if I change my gamma to linear here in this node that is now going to be my exposure node, now I'm operating in linear stops. So I can actually go in and cut my gain down to a 0.5, and I've now trimmed one full stop from the image. 0.25 would be 2 stops. The math there is your input divided by 2 to the power of the number of stops that you want to move things. So if I start with a 1 and I divide that by 2 to the power of 2, that gives me a 2-stop reduction, and that comes out to a 0.25 if my initial value is a 1. Same thing going to the right. If I start with a 1 and I multiply it when I want to go up by 2 to the power of 1 or 2 to the power of 4, I'm going to end up with a 2 for 1 stop or a 4 for 2 stops, etc. So that's one situation where we'd want to use it. I also love to use this for balance. So if I set my gamma to linear here, I like that you're going to feel your controls are a little bit less touchy. Again, I'm using gain here, and you are theoretically doing a cleaner, simpler adjustment to the response of the sensor initially. It's almost like you're changing the way the sensor initially responded in the red, green, and blue channels when you operate in this way. Because remember, sensors are all linear before they receive log encodings or before they're stored into files or raw assets or whatever the case may be. So it's almost an analog for changing the relative response strength of the red, the green, and the blue, and you can get really good results there too. That's just 2 examples of working in linear that I like. You can also get interesting contrast adjustments in linear by working your gamma, like so. So there's more contrast, less contrast. Another fun one to play around with. So that's a couple of them. There's lots more beyond those, but that's 2, exposure and balance, that I use in literally every project that I color grade, just because they are really, really useful and they feel good in my hands.
Have you ever experienced that a color space transform doesn't yield the desired results? For example, if you have a red white gamut, a 3D log 10 clip that you're mapping into DaVinci White gamut, for example, and that kind of breaks the clip, for example, at the bottom, or especially at the bottom, or maybe even in the highlights?
You know, I can't recall having experienced that in recent memory, but like, let's look at a couple of these images, which, by the way, were made or are distributed kind of with the intent of being stress tests for gamut issues with like very bright, very saturated things like these light tubes back here. And you can kind of see a little bit of a problem cropping up here. And if we just bypass for now and do a manual color management, let's see if we can't answer that question. So this is my red to DaVinci Wide Gamut preset, and then we will do a DaVinci Wide Gamut to 709 preset. And if we look at this input transform, here's how we're handling that right now. So in this case, I don't necessarily think that the CST is breaking anything. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I actually don't remember off the top of my head if red wide gamut RGB is actually a larger gamut than DaVinci Wide Gamut. That's possible. And if so, that could be the source of some issues there. And similarly, I don't recall if it has potentially greater dynamic range than DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. I definitely think that's possible as well. So those are situations where you might encounter the types of issues that you're asking about. And there are different ways you could deal with that. But one of them, or 2 of them, would be for dynamic range issues, like in your highlights, to do some luminance mapping and just leave these settings turned off and let Resolve handle the rest. Or if you're still not getting luck, you could try kind of modulating these things by hand, like so. And then on the color side, you could try gamut mapping and doing some saturation compression to fit red wide gamut into DaVinci wide gamut. Now you guys have got me curious. Actually, like I said, I can't recall on the dynamic range or on the color gamut volume side of things if one or both of those things from IPP2 may in fact be larger than DaVinci wide gamut, but I think that may be the case, and that if so, could definitely be a culprit for the type of problem that you're describing. So I can't recall off the top of my head having recently run into that, but that's some of the ways that you can deal with that. I'm actually going to be releasing a tool here on the channel very soon that helps you with that. Essentially, like as you guys know, something that I'm like I really love about ACES 1.3 is the gamut compression scheme that they came up with for dealing with out of gamut, out of boundary colors in ACES. I liked it so much that I went in and I ported it to work in non-ACES spaces, and that's going to be a free download that I'm going to make available to you guys very soon. So that could be another potential way of dealing with, whether it's a red or any other camera, dealing with stuff that after being input mapped into your working space has some kind of artifacting or clipping going on that you don't want to see. And that would be like, if you were to take any of the approaches that I just described, your sort of like implicit assumption would be, well, DaVinci wide gamut intermediate is sufficient dynamic range and color volume. So if I compress or clip or clamp things off to avoid artifacts, that's not inherently a problem because those are not vital colors and luminance values to my grade that I'm getting rid of. If you didn't feel that way, if you're like, no, I want to hang on to every inch of those, another option that you could go with would be to work in red wide gamut log 3G10. If you wanted to take like the lightest possible touch, if all you had was red material and you felt like your input transform to DaVinci wide gamut was breaking stuff, you could work all in red wide gamut RGB and just change your output transform over here at the end of the node graph, like so. You could just say, oh, this is just red wide gamut RGB, red log 3G10, and you can delete this. The color grading police won't arrest you, I promise. And I won't come over and arrest you or harass you for it. That would be totally valid, especially if you arrived at that workflow after having explored different options and felt like this was the best one for you. That would totally work as well.
Question about the color charts. And basically the question is that in your last video, you were using a color checker that is dedicated for photography instead of video. Do you know if there are any differences between color coordinates between video and photo?
I don't know off the top of my head. In fact, I didn't even know that that color chart we were working with was for photo instead of video. The reality, unless I'm missing something and I need to get some color science schooling, the reality is it's just known anchor points. As long as Resolve has the correct values for those colors on that chart, it really doesn't matter whether it's photocentric or a video-centric chart in terms of its intent. It's just a known set of values that Resolve to say, well, if red should have been this red, but it's that red, then I'm going to change all the reds to this. And if gray should have been that gray, but it's this gray, I'm going to change all the grays to that. So that's the idea there, is that it's just using the delta, the difference between what it knows those values were when they were shown to the camera versus what the values being shown to it are now, to come up with a best fit to get reds, greens, and blues and grayscale more aligned with what they theoretically should be.
Another question here about color management. Wouldn't the choice of Rec 709 scene for the timeline space come from the assumption that your Rec 709 footage is encoded in BT 1886?
Yes, I think so. To be honest, like the choice to timeline color space in Rec 709 scene, yeah, like that, it depends on how you're input mapping. Like you could say, I assume that my source is 1886 and I'm grading in Rec 709 scene. You know, like actually, I always forget they make this a little more complicated with the working space. To be honest with you, I don't remember what the Rec 709 scene spec denotes here. I would, when you're talking about grading Rec 709, I would tend to take one of two approaches. I'm trying to think of a simple, focused way to talk about this. I wouldn't worry too much about timeline color space if you have decided to grade in a display space, if that makes sense. Because if you're grading in a display space, I'm going to, I think you should assume that you can't get, really the point of getting a timeline color space correctly declared is fundamentally so that you can get back linear. That's what the HDR zones palette is trying to do. That's what the mechanism that you're relying on when you do color space and gamma tags, for example. But if you're grading in a display space because your source is in a display space, can you reliably get back to linear? You can't bet on that, in my opinion. You really can't bet that you're going to be able to neatly and perfectly decode that display encoding and get back to a scene linear state of that image. So at that point, things like if I was to grade, it's funny that this comes up. I'm grading a project in the coming weeks that I'm actually thinking about, you know what? I think this is just a feel it out, grade it as you receive, grade it display referred, no color management, no looks, no LUTs, no nothing. Just feel your way through it because it's such delicate material. None of it is none of it is in a camera log format, and none of it is, it's in a bunch of different formats. It's a doc. So I'm thinking about doing that. And if I were to do that, if I do it on this project, a couple of the boundaries that I'll put up for myself, there will be no color space or gamma tags for sure. Because again, these are relying on the assumption that Resolve knows how to linearize the image and move between color spaces, but it's not going to be able to, because the truth is we can't get back to scene linear from some unknown display encoding curve that was used for that material. And the other thing that I'm certainly going to outlaw is the HDR zones palette, because that is relying on the same mechanism. This works well to the extent that you can accurately inform Resolve how to decode the curve of your source image. And if it's a display state image, you can't tell Resolve with much confidence how to decode that. So Rec 709 scene, could you choose that if you were working in BT 1886? Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I would say in a larger context, I wouldn't worry too much about it. If you have chosen to grade in a display space and for whatever reason, then I would just the only thing I would really worry about in here is setting your output color space to Rec 709 Gamma 24, assuming that's your output, and then just playing with the rest and feeling your way through it, and not using color space or gamma tags or the HDR zones palette.
Let's go back to lookup tables. And Jim is asking, basically, how do you create lookup tables that work in DaVinci Wide Gamut? Could you demonstrate how to do it, doing color management in the project settings and doing it via color space transforms nodes?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the fun thing about, you guys have heard me talk so much about how any LUT is going to be designed to work in one color space, right? And I remember, I can't say that I heard that much when I was learning this stuff because I had to figure these things out for myself, but I can remember beginning to piece that together, that, a LUT can really only be optimized for one color space at a time in terms of input and output. And when you think about it that way, and when you hear me say, it needs to be designed for that color space, that can actually make things sound more complicated than they are. If you want to design a LUT for DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, let's just bounce around here a little bit. I'm going to turn this 2383 off since we're done with it. We're back in our good old vanilla color management that we always talk about here on the channel, okay? If we want to design a LUT for DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, here would be a very, very simple, very, very functional design for a LUT. I'm just going to do my good old trick of pulling my DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray and do a simple mid-gray preserving contrast curve. And actually, this will be fun because I haven't done it this way in a little bit, but I believe if I output this as a LUT, so this is my LUT, this is my look that I want to cook into a LUT. I believe if I output this, I'm just going to get the curve of things. Let's have a look. Hang on one moment here. I'm going to go to my face so you guys don't have to look at my unsightly desktop. Ah, even better. Okay. Now we can go back to my feed. So I'm using Lattice, by the way. Lattice is an awesome program if you're working with LUTs. Yeah, that's it. So this is a very simple, very effective, very clean, simple LUT for DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And you can see how designed for DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate now sounds like kind of an overcomplication, doesn't it? Like, what does it really mean? When I tell you that this LUT was designed for DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, what does that really mean? All it really means is that I built it inside of a DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate point in my image pipeline, and I was viewing my image through that context when I made the decision that the shoulder should be here and not there. You know what I mean? Like, it's really just a matter of the context that the designer had when they created the asset. So there's nothing that's that peculiar or particular about designing for one color space over another, except that you want to have the appropriate viewing context when you do. So that would be like the very simple answer of like, build whatever you want to build and then export it as a 3D LUT. That's the baseline. I've taught, like 2-week courses that build on that and say like, oh, well, what else can we do? What else should we avoid? What are some of the, how do we make sure that the LUT stays clean as we start complicating it? But that would be one very simple example of how we could draw a curve and then export that as it doesn't even need to be a 3D LUT in this case. I could cook this down into a 1D LUT, although it's doing some 3D stuff, which is interesting, I guess, because of the Y channel interaction there. But at any rate, that would be the simple example. And then if I were doing this in nodes instead of in project level color management, I'm not going to demo that all out right now, but basically all you would do is you'd have your nodes strung out. I mean, I'm lying. I can do this so quickly that why the heck not? So let's bypass our color management here and just build my sandwich of color management. So we're going in from log C3 to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, and then we're going out from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to Rec 709. This is now my viewing context, and then I came in and said, hey, I'm going to draw a curve inside of this, and how am I deciding that the shoulder goes here and not there, or here and not there? I'm looking at the image, or I'm looking at the 20 or 100 test images that I'm evaluating when I build this look. Once I'm happy with it, how would I generate the LUT under these conditions? All I would do is turn these things off. Say I don't need a transform into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate because the expectation of this LUT is that you're already giving it DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. I don't need a transform from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to 709 because the expectation is that this LUT that I'm creating will give back DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, right? So this would be the way that you would do this if you were color managing in nodes. Just turn off the pieces that you were using for your viewing context when designing, so that instead you are getting only the elements that need to manipulate the image within your operational color space, in this case, DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate.
Another question here about lookup tables. Now, basically about the Voyager lookup tables. Why are the Voyager lookup tables solely available in DaVinci Wide Gamut? Do they have a version for Aces, or are they only for DaVinci Wide Gamut? In that case, why?
Ooh, juicy question. Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a cheat. I think we'll probably end up doing a video on this in the fairly near future. But let's just do a quick experiment here. Let's just grab one of the Voyager Essentials here. I feel like it's like playing favorites with your kids for me to say I have a favorite in the Voyagers, because they're the Voyager LUTs, because they're all really good and I love them all. However, I do kind of have a favorite. I really love Nirvana. It just feels like a bucket of delicious paint that gets dropped over the image. I'm going to scale it back just a little bit. So let's say we love Nirvana here in... Now I'm using Nirvana, which is from the Essentials set in the exact prescribed form right here in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And I'm going to grab a still of that and call this DaVinci Wide Gamut. Now check this out. If I change my color science to Aces CCT, like so, and I hit save, and then I just go to this LUT and I tell it, hey, for the duration of the LUT, change yourself to DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, this works. It works really nicely, but we get a different result, don't we? That's different than what we were getting before. Even though I am telling Resolve for the duration of this node, move into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, apply this LUT, then move back into ACES. So we're making a round trip in order to apply the LUT in the domain that it needs to be applied in. But the end result is still different. Well, why? The difference is in the rendering transform of ACES versus Resolve Color Management. So the short answer here is you could use Voyager in ACES and simply do these color space and gamma tags that I just identified here. And you could use any of the Voyager Pro or Essentials pack inside of ACES. The only caveat, and the reason why we don't say, hey, these are for ACES, is because when I built these LUTs for you guys, my viewing context, this is what we were just talking about with Jim a moment ago, this was not my viewing context. This was not the image that I saw when I said, okay, Voyager is ready to go, ship it, it's perfect. The image that I saw when I reached that point was this one. I'm just gonna flip back to these settings. I sure wish they would persist, but what do I know? I just work here. So we're gonna do this. When it was time to ship Voyager and say, is it good enough for prime time? Is it ready to go? This is what I was looking at when I said, hell yeah, it is. Ship it. This thing is awesome. So it's, again, a matter of the context of the designer. The context that this designer had when I was designing Voyager was Resolve Color Management. Now, could I go back in and try my level best to one-to-one get all of these components and modules and ingredients to match inside of an ACES context? Yes. That would take a long time. That would take probably as much time as it took me to initially design these things. And my preference, because all projects have a set amount of time and effort and energy that we can put into them, my preference was to devote all of my time and effort and energy to making the best looking set of transforms I could for one system, rather than spending half the time on design and then half the time on trying to match what I got to a good place in one system to look the exact same in another system. So that's why the LUTs are not available in ACES. You can still use them in ACES with the workflow that I just showed you. Just the only caveat there is that you're going to be seeing something that I never saw when I said, hey, Voyager's good to go, ship it. So hope that's helpful.
Is there any reason to do color management in the first place if you are mapping Rec 709 content and you are delivering Rec 709 content?
Yeah, good question. And that's one that we've answered here before, but it's been a little while and it's always a good one to recap. So again, recapping, is there a reason if I'm starting Rec 709 and I'm ending up Rec 709, why do I really need to jump through all the hoops of moving into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate and doing all these operations and things? And the answer is definitely maybe. I just gave you guys an example of a project I'm contemplating where I may not do that. I may just stay in Rec 709 because it's delicate footage and it seems that it's going to benefit most from just me giving it touch and, like intuitive response shot by shot. In general, is there a benefit to that? Yes. Yes, there is. And there's a couple of benefits to it, in fact. The first one is that, like, I've talked to you guys about this before. Again, so much of like the science and the systems and the rules that I talk about here on the channel are in service of creativity and intuition. One of the things that always working, for example, always working in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, one of the things that affords us is, like right now, when I go in and I grade this image, it does not matter what this image started as, whether it's airy or red or Rec 709. When I go to grade this image and I grab for my offset, for example, I already know how it's going to respond. I have a relationship with this. It's kind of like a musician, right? They don't need to move their finger to a fret and strum the string to know what it's going to sound like. They know what's going to happen before they ever put their finger on that fret, right? That's a huge, huge benefit to us as artists. And remember, we're artists, we're colorists, right? You want to know what your tools are going to do. You want to have a relationship with your tools. You want to have a connection with them, regardless of what the camera format is and regardless of the particulars of the job. One of the best ways to cultivate that connection is to always work in the same color space. How do you do that? Well, you got to color manage if you're going to make that dream a reality. So everything is moving into that common color space, and then forward from there, you're going out to whatever your display space is. So that's number one. The other thing that kind of comes along with that, it's a different dimension or different aspect of that same thing, is if you like to use LUTs, By the way, I like to use LUTs. We were just talking about Voyager. LUTs or their equivalent play a role in virtually every image that I touch in my color grading practice. If you like to use LUTs, unless you want to have a copy of every LUT in your library for every conceivable color space that you might grade in, that's the other key benefit of having a stock go-to working space, because no matter what the source material is, as long as you can get into that working space in a sound way, now you can use the Voyager LUT pack or my Kodak 2383 or whatever the LUT may be, because your working space never changes. So you don't have to have duplicates or versions of every LUT that you love for every color space you might encounter, because you are moving the image to meet that LUT as opposed to having variations on the LUT for every contingency you might encounter out there in the wild. So there's actually other benefits beyond that, but those two are the main ones. It's for touch, for feel, for intuition, for connection to your controls, and for the ability to use tools and LUTs that are designed for one space and to only need to have a library of tools and LUTs designed for a single space as opposed to half a dozen or a dozen or more.
Let's go to HDR for a second. And basically the question is, should we do first HDR or SDR? I heard that the TV show Mindhunter, for example, was graded in SDR first. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love this question, and I think what I love most about it is, like, if you go and ask 10 colorists who have any business answering it right now, like colorists who actually do HDR and SDR grades regularly, most of them are going to have a vehement opinion. They're not all going to agree with each other. There are going to be some of them who are like, it's SDR, it has to be SDR first, you must do SDR first, end of story. And they'll have reasons for that. And you talk to another colorist and they're going to say, it's HDR, it has to be HDR, that's the only valid answer to the question. And they'll have reasons for that, and they will have no wiggle on that. They'll be like, it's ridiculous to think about doing it any other way. I've done it both ways. I can tell you it works. There are pros and cons to doing it both ways. And again, it kind of depends on what you think of as your image. This is part of like this sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for? This is part of like the mystery of modern day color grading, like the paradox of modern day color grading. That's the word I wanted. We never actually see our image. We only get view into our image, if that makes sense. So right now, this image, what I'm grading, what is going to become, for example, if this is a show that's going to go to Netflix and by the time all's said and done, I'm going to deliver 8,000 supplemental deliverables to them for archival and such. This might be the image that goes to Netflix, but what's actually going to be stored as what's called the graded archival master is this. This is the grade inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, okay? Now, there's no monitor that can show me this. There's no monitor that has the primaries of DaVinci Wide Gamut or the dynamic range of DaVinci Intermediate. So this is my image, but I will never get to see it, at least not today, maybe in 10 years when they start releasing DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate monitors or their equivalent. So that's the paradox of modern day color grading, is we never actually see our image. We simply get different lenses or views or windows into our image. So the reason I bring this up right now is because the question that comes up of like, should you do HDR and then trim SDR, or should you do SDR and then trim HDR? That becomes a philosophical question for you, the colorist, and really for your client, even more importantly. Which lens do you believe is more meaningful? Which lens do you believe more completely or best reflects the image that's inside of that room that we'll never be able to get quite inside of all the way? If you think it's the SDR, then you should do the SDR and trim the HDR. If you think it's the HDR, then you should start with HDR and trim SDR. And of course, the point of multiple deliverables is that you don't have to choose. You can have more than one deliverable format and preserve creative intent across those different formats in a very reliable way. Like that is a thing that works. I can tell you that works. I've done it tons of times. But that question of which do you start with, I think is fascinating. And the best answer I've been able to come up with is it depends on what the client, even more than us, the colorist, what does the client see as the more meaningful representation of their image? Are there parts of their image that exist above 100 nits and outside Rec 7 or 9 that once you trim those off, there's a little bit of the life of the image being cut away. If the client feels that way, you should definitely start with HDR. Conversely, do they feel that they like to have the constraints and the sort of traditional boundaries of a Rec 709 image, and anything that gets added on top of there is really just seasoning, and it's designed for brighter viewing surrounds or to satisfy a deliverable demand? If that's the case, then you should probably start with the SDR. So that's a long, dreamy answer to the question, but that's one that I think about a lot, and I hope that's some helpful ideas.
Let's go back to lookup tables, also your lookup tables. Could you expand on the sort of operations outside of Resolve's capabilities that are inside your lookup tables?
I feel like I keep hitting my microphone all day today. I hope that's... I'm always sensitive to like people who are watching live or watching after the fact with headphones, and it's like I just thumped you on the head every time I inadvertently bump my microphone. So sorry. Yeah, that's a really good question. So can I detail the operations that are happening in my LUTs that don't work, that are like not native to Resolve or not things that are available to us inside of Resolve? I can. I can give it to you in broad principles. And a lot of these, really all of them, like the philosophy that drives my choice of tools, and in many cases the construction of the tools that I used to create things like the Voyager LUT pack, it's all driven by philosophies that come from the Colorist 10 Commandments. Broad beats narrow, simple beats complex, macro beats micro. These are all the things kicking around in my head when I'm thinking in my... I do feel like I have multiple heads sometimes and multiple personalities, but in my head, singular, all the things kicking around in my head when I'm thinking about look design. And the biggest ones for me, like if I had to put one big banner on the answer to that question, it's that Resolve in general, not always, not across the board, Resolve in general works in straight lines. And everything that we want to do and that, by the way, is appropriate and sensible and often ideal for shot to shot level color grading. We want to work in straight lines. We want to say, hey, take that and put it down here. We were talking about working with linear exposure and linear color balance before. That's like a very concrete, great example of like working in straight lines. That's exactly what we want to do. If I want to trim exposure a third of a stop, trim my exposure by 1 divided by 2 to the power of 1/3. Yeah, my math is escaping me. But yeah, like if you wanted to do it, if you want to trim a stop, you want to work in a linear domain. That is the domain of color grading. And I don't necessarily mean linear tone curve always, but that is one good example. When we're doing look development, because we're coming up with fits and we are trying to, I'm getting dreamy again on us here, but this is really the way I think about it. When you're thinking about look design, you don't have the ability, like when I design a look for you guys, when I design the Voyager pack, or when I'm designing looks for private clients or colorists or post facilities, I don't have the luxury of getting to see all the images that are ever going to pass through that transform. In fact, I don't even get the opportunity to see a very small fraction of all the images that are going to pass through that transform. 99 point some odd % of the images that pass through the transform that I'm creating for Voyager or for my private clients, I will never see those images. And yet my transform has to succeed for those images. How in the world do I do that? The way I do that is by thinking about things in terms of corralling them into regions. So I can't say every time I see this value, it should go to that exact value. I have to say, oh, shadows should get pushed a little bit if they're in such and such range. Highlights should get pumped up a little bit if they're in such and such range, just to make an example. Or saturations. Low saturations should become a little more colorful. High saturations should hold or maybe become a little less colorful. These are simple examples, but it's trying to give you an example of the way that I think about like corralling values and gently pushing things around, as opposed to explicitly saying that pot needs to be more saturated or her skin is too colorful. I don't have that luxury when I'm doing look dev. None of us do. So instead, we need to think about gently biasing or corralling things into the area that we want to see them go, or into the or to like gently imparting the character onto them that we want them to take on, So that is the fundamental idea at work in the tools that I use for look development that are not native to Resolve. I'm trying to figure out how can I do that really successfully. And by the way, if you want to know the most successful imaging tool in the history of motion imaging for achieving what I'm describing, it's film. Film does everything in curves. Nothing works in straight lines. Everything is gentle. Everything has a round edge to it in film. And that's one of the biggest reasons why film is such a robust and desirable format and why it has such a beautiful aesthetic, is because it's all about gently pushing things around without ever breaking or going off cliff edges or snapping adjacent pixels into two different directions. It's just gently corralling values into advantageous positions. So a lot of the inspiration actually comes from the behavior of film systems as well and what I've learned about those systems. So I know that's an abstract answer. I don't mean to be coy, but the only other answer I could give you is like, well, I'm using, like such and such math to achieve that type of gentle curvature. And then we would be here for the next 60 days. And you guys all have lives, as do I. But I hope that's some helpful philosophy anyway. That's the biggest like learning curve, to make a pun, that comes with look development, is you have to start thinking about how do you bias and trend things in the right direction, as opposed to like, how do you get this pixel there? You can't do that when you're doing look development. You can do that in color grading. You can say like, hey, how do I make her eyes 25% more blue? I can do that easily in color grading. I've got 5 different ways I can think of to do that right now. When you're doing look dev, you don't know what the subject is going to be, so you have to think about biasing characteristics in the direction that your creative intent dictates.
Can we talk about how to create a lookup table for a camera, and specifically for a Blackmagic camera, since the color spaces are a little bit messy?
Yeah, that's a great idea. So let's talk about building LUTs for cameras. So we're going to talk about building viewing LUTs. We've already done building some creative LUTs earlier today. So we're going to talk about building viewing LUTs now. So let's do this. This is something you could do. We're going to actually use, we're going to use LUTs to build LUTs. What do you guys think about that? That kind of goes to my favorite expression that you guys may have heard me use before. I love making things, but I really, really love making things that make things. So we're gonna make a thing from something else. So here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna bypass my color management. By the way, a really good just rule of thumb to make things easy for yourself, make things simple, is just remember, anytime you're building a LUT, it's a pretty good idea. Like we talked about how you could build a LUT with project level color management turned on, and also with your node-based color management. So you could definitely do it either way, depending on what you're trying to achieve, and assuming you get all the pieces right. In general, if you're building a LUT, doesn't matter what kind. If it's a pure creative LUT for DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, if it's a viewing LUT for on set, make things easier on yourself. Building LUTs is all about details. Make things easier on yourself and just use node-based color management so you can see the whole chain spelled out there, and you can double check yourself if things are feeling funky, okay? That's what I'm doing effectively here by bypassing my color management. And we are now going to build a LUT for a Blackmagic camera. And let's assume we're using the latest, greatest, coolest Blackmagic camera, because there are certainly a lot of options. So if we were going to do that, that would be Blackmagic Design Wide Gamut Gen 4 5. Input gamma would be Blackmagic Design, where is it? Film Gen 5, okay? This would be like the standard, like current color space for Blackmagic cameras. Now, it depends on what you want to do here. Like, if you wanted to build a really simple, like, kind of vibeless LUT for your Blackmagic camera, this would basically do it right here. Just right-click, generate this LUT, and now you've got a LUT that takes you from Blackmagic, Gen 5 to 709 Gamma 2.4. You're done. That's pretty simple, right? That's not really going to be any better than the log to 709 LUTs that come preloaded with the Blackmagic cameras, or the ones that are loaded into Resolve. So let's go a little bit further with that. And here's how I like to think about building LUTs, especially because for me, when I'm building LUTs for a camera, it's not just for myself and it's not just for fun. Usually I'm building a LUT for a camera for my client, and I'm building it around a look we have developed so that they can be shooting through that look on set. And ultimately, they're going to bring those images back to me, and I need to be able to grade under that look in my stock DaVinci Wide Gamut intermediate space. So for that reason, even though it's a little bit more complex, typically what I do when I'm designing LUTs is I go ahead and I move through my working space, even though I don't need a working space per se, because I'm not doing any grading, I'm just outputting a LUT, I still will. So I'm going to turn this off and this off. So now all I'm doing is moving into DaVinci Wide Gamut, okay? And now what am I going to add after this? I'm going to add my output transform, right? DaVinci Wide Gamut to Rec 709. Okay, cool. So if I were to output this, this would be identical to exactly what I had a moment ago when I was going straight from blackmagic to Rec 709. I've just complicated matters by putting it in 2 nodes instead of 1. Okay, great. Maybe that's not really worth the trip, right? But now, because I have this DaVinci Wide Gamut cutout, this portion in between where I can do stuff, I could do my own look development in here. I could use one of the Voyager LUTs if I wanted to. Let's turn these settings off like so. I could use one of these Voyager LUTs. I could use the Kodak 2383 LUT if I wanted to give you a 2383 for Blackmagic camera viewing LUT. This would be that. I could go to my key output gain and pull that back a little bit if I wanted to. And now let's say like this is getting kind of interesting. This is like a transform that's taking me from Blackmagic out to Rec 709 and imparting some 2383 on the way. Well, that's a LUT that I might want to cook and put into my camera, right? That's kind of interesting. So here's the magical thing about LUTs. This is another like property that is really fun to remember about LUTs, and we get to do a cool vocab word to boot. Anybody ever heard the term concatenate before? I like saying it, concatenate. It's fun. All that really means is stacking stuff together. So LUTs have the ability to concatenate transforms together. So I can describe this series of 3 adjustments with a single LUT. I can concatenate them into a single LUT. That's kind of cool. That's one of the main utilities of LUTs. Is you can combine a bunch of discrete, complex operations into a single thing that does a thing, to go back to our definition of LUTs that we explored this week. So that's one of the fun things. So if I wanted to output this and have a full stack that takes Blackmagic in and returns Rec 709, all I got to do is output this like so. And you guys can now see, hopefully more clearly, why I like to recommend working in nodes for your color management when you're building LUTs. Because if you're ever unclear of like, wait, what am I building? What is this LUT that I'm designing ultimately going to end up needing from the user in terms of input, and what should it be giving back? What can I tell that user that it's going to be giving back to them? Well, you can see it at either end of your chain. What it wants is this, right? What it is going to give back is this. So the input color space at the head of your node graph will tell you the expected input of the LUT that you're about to produce, and the output color space of the CST at the end of your node graph will tell you what that LUT is going to be giving back to you once you feed that in, if that makes sense. So this is how I would build a LUT for a Blackmagic camera, and how I would impart some creative character along the way. And of course, I wouldn't have to use my 2383. We could go back to Nelvana like we were using before, or any other of my Essentials pack or Pro pack, or any other LUTs that work inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, or any hand-drawn creative manipulations, which we've talked about doing here on the channel in the past. So that would be kind of a primer on how to build out a viewing LUT for use on set.
All right, also another question here about camera lookup tables. How can you basically use a film look or a plugin like the Enhancer or Filmbox or whatever to create a show LUT basically? How do you convert the Rec 709 output into a working space properly, and how can you do it using a plugin basically?
Yeah, great question. And I love that we're getting to kind of dive deep on LUTs here. So here would be my thoughts on that. I'm going to reset everything here for now. I'm going to answer that using Filmbox. Filmbox isn't paying me anything. I don't even know if they know me, but I love their product. I use it for, like, if you want to get a good film emulation, this is definitely the best plugin. in my opinion. So a couple things to note. If you are using this, I'm going to set my source to DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. First of all, worth noting that there are things happening right now. Well, let me turn my color management back on. Or actually, no. I'm doing this all wrong. This is good. Log C. So first thing to note, there are things happening in this plugin that cannot be contained in a LUT, right? Anybody know what those are? Excuse me. It's the grain and the texture, right? We can't get those cooked into a LUT. The LUT won't contain them. So if we wanted to get a more contextual rendering of what the LUT is actually going to do, I would turn off my halation and my grain, and I think there's probably a softness setting living somewhere in here as well. Let's see, color and tone. Maybe not. Maybe I have to imagine that part. Yeah, but in any case, this is giving us closer to what we should expect to see the LUT do. Now, just for context, if we wanted to render a LUT that gives us the Filmbox, 250D to, like print stock look, then we could just export a LUT right here from the plugin, and it's going to take in this case, Log C3 and output 709 Gamma 24. So that's pretty cool, right? Well, what if we wanted it to be like a scene space look, like so? Well, they've got these options in here for keeping you like in a display space, like so. So that would be Resolve Color Management HDR, for example, would be the one for DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And unroll highlights, this connects up to our prior conversation about the rolled highlights in my 2383, for example. If you wanted to unroll those and get some higher peak luminance, they've actually got this slider built in for that, okay? Of course, for this image to make sense, we would need to see it through a Rec 709 rendering, like so. And now if we look at this image, you're seeing this transform, this kind of film level transform happening to the image like so. And we're getting out to Rec 709 accordingly, okay? So again, we now know about LUTs that we can concatenate things. So if we wanted to export a LUT of all this, we could just right click and say export LUT. Although actually there's a setting in OpenFX plugins that either allows you to include them in an exported 3D LUT or not. So I actually don't know off the top of my head if Filmbox lets you do that. If not, then you would need to kind of do two steps. First, export a LUT directly from here, and then stack that exported LUT back in Resolve with this 709 transform. If for whatever reason you wanted to get the 709 transform happening from a CST versus with Filmbox, I can't think of a reason off the top of my head why you'd want to do that. I would simply do this. Okay, so that would be how I would do it with Filmbox. How would I do it with the enhancer? I don't know. That's not a product that I've used before or tested. I can't say much positive or negative about it, just because I haven't had much thorough chance to test it. And as most of you guys know, I'm not a big consumer of plugins. I spend most of my time fixating on my own tools and development, but Filmbox is one that has found its way into my workflow because I do feel like it's got some really good aesthetics to offer to the image. So that's how I would think about using Filmbox to produce a LUT, whether that's for on set or if I wanted this just to be a grading LUT, then I would set this to DaVinci Wide Gamut here, and then RCM HDR here, and I would, like the image isn't rendering quite correctly because this isn't mapped into DaVinci Wide Gamut, but if I were to export a 3D LUT of this would effectively give you like a film profile that is designed to work inside of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. So that's a good place to round things out in our exploration of LUTs, and we got to go kind of deep on LUTs and a bunch of other stuff today. What did you guys think of the double header? Was that crazy? Was that way too much information and way too much talking from me for one grade school session? Maybe, but it was also kind of fun. I hope you guys had a blast. I had a blast. We got to cover a lot of good stuff. Lots of really great questions from y'all, and our questions of the week I enjoyed answering as well. So maybe we'll continue to play around with that. Let me know if you like that. That's it, guys. I hope you go have an awesome Friday and have an awesome weekend, and looking forward to our videos next week and to seeing y'all again for our next episode of Grade School. Thanks to my buddy Rafa for co-hosting with me, and I will see you guys all very soon.